I remember the sound of the lock. It was small, metallic, final. The kind of sound that doesn't echo in the house but in your ribs, right where your breath should settle. She said it was for my own good, that I needed rest, that the fall had left me confused. But I knew better. There was no confusion, only humiliation. If you've ever been dismissed by your own family, this story is for you. Subscribe to this channel for more stories like this one. My name is Margaret from Ohio. Please comment below and tell me where you're listening from. It started a few months earlier. I used to have a rhythm to my mornings. A soft shuffle in slippers, the scent of coffee drifting up from the old percolator Harold bought back in the '70s. The radio would hum low, usually some classical tune, and I'd feed the finches outside the kitchen window. I liked the peace, the way light slipped through the curtains in stripes, the way our house seemed to breathe with me. When Harold passed, that rhythm faltered. 52 years of marriage folded into a quiet house that suddenly felt like an empty church. My son, Daniel, tried to help. He was kind in that distracted way men often are, meaning well, but lost in his own life. His wife, Lacey, was the opposite, bright, efficient, everything in her world color-coded and budgeted. She handled things, too many things. It started subtly. She began paying bills to make it easier for me. She transferred my prescriptions to her preferred pharmacy. She convinced Daniel that I shouldn't live alone, just until Mom feels stronger, she'd said. I didn't protest. Grief makes you soft like dough before it bakes into resolve. I told myself it was kindness. Their house was larger, newer, all stainless steel and spotless surfaces. My world shrank to one bedroom, beige walls, beige carpet, a beige kind of silence. I brought my quilt, my photo of Harold in uniform, my teacups. Lacey said clutter made her anxious. I smiled and said I understood. At first, it was manageable. I helped around the house, folded laundry, read bedtime stories to the twins. But gradually, my role became smaller. Meals were planned without me. Conversations happened in whispers at the kitchen island. The children started knocking before entering my room, as if I were a tenant, not their grandmother. One night, I overheard Lacey tell Daniel that I was slipping. She said I repeated myself, forgot things, misplaced objects. I wanted to burst out of my room to remind her that I was grieving, not fading. But I stayed quiet. It's astonishing how silence can feel like dignity when you've been cornered. Then came the fall. I was watering her hanging plants in the sunroom when my shoe caught the edge of a rug. I went down hard. The pain in my hip was sharp, but sharper still was Lacey's expression when she found me, not fear, not concern, but inconvenience. I saw it in her eyes, a flicker of calculation. After the hospital, she insisted on supervising me. She moved my dresser, installed cameras in the hall for safety, and had my doctor forward reports to her email. When I protested, she reminded me gently that I was lucky to have family at all. That's when I began to understand. Kindness, when controlled, becomes a leash. A week later, she started locking my room at night. She said it was because I wandered. I hadn't wandered anywhere. My only sin was staying awake past her bedtime. I'd heard her tell Daniel she worried I might leave the stove on, the stove that I was no longer allowed to touch. The first time I tried the doorknob and found it locked, I thought it was a mistake. The second night, it clicked from the outside. That was when something inside me, something dormant, stirred awake. I didn't cry, I didn't yell. I sat by the window, watching the light from the neighbor's porch flicker through the trees. I told myself I was still me, even if I was behind a door. I began keeping a notebook, every detail, every small indignity. The day she replaced Harold's photo with a generic art print, the morning she accidentally donated my coat, the time she used my savings card and said the balance must have reset, I wrote it all down. Because stories once written become evidence. Then one afternoon, while folding towels in the laundry room, I noticed a document peeking out from beneath a stack of mail, a property tax notice. My name wasn't on it. The house, the one Harold and I had built, the one Daniel and Lacey now lived in, was listed under a trust I didn't recognize. Something cold slid down my spine. That night, I asked Daniel about it casually. He said Lacey had mentioned updating the family estate plan. I nodded, pretending it made sense, but Harold had handled every document meticulously before he passed. He'd even left a binder labeled in case of emergencies. I hadn't touched it since the funeral. When I asked Lacey where that binder was, she smiled too quickly and said she didn't know, maybe in storage. That was when I knew. The missing binder was the thread. I waited until they were gone one weekend, a wellness retreat she'd planned. With my spare key in careful hands, I found the binder tucked behind the furnace closet, sealed in a plastic bag. The pages were still there, Harold's handwriting steady, precise. Inside, a note in his familiar blue ink: "If anything happens to me, Margaret, this clause ensures your protection." I didn't yet know what clause he meant. But the seed of justice was planted that night. I closed the binder and sat back, heart pounding. I could almost hear Harold's voice, calm, certain, the kind of voice that always knew how to steady me. I didn't know that this small discovery, this single handwritten line, would one day make a courtroom fall silent. The binder became my secret heartbeat. Each night after they went to bed, I'd pull it out from beneath my pillow and read a few more pages by the soft glow of the bedside lamp. Harold's voice was in every margin, the kind of neat handwriting born from decades of engineering drafts and meticulous planning. He had thought of everything: insurance policies, tax receipts, medical directives, and finally, one section labeled property and trust clauses. The legal phrasing was dense, but certain words leapt out like light through fog: life estate, surviving spouse, protective clause. My name was written beside each one. It was as if he'd built an invisible wall around me, one Lacey hadn't noticed. Still, I needed proof beyond my interpretation. So when the home nurse stopped by that week to check my hip recovery, I asked her quietly if she knew any notaries in town. She gave me a name and a number on a scrap of paper: her cousin, she said, who sometimes worked with elderly clients dealing with estate paperwork. I folded it into my notebook. I didn't call yet, timing mattered. Lacey's behavior shifted after that weekend. She must have sensed something. Control breeds paranoia. She began micromanaging even my meals: smaller portions, fewer choices. She changed the Wi-Fi password and told me she'd handle my emails to keep me from stress. Each act was framed as care, but smelled faintly of ownership. Daniel, meanwhile, drifted. I could see exhaustion settling into his eyes whenever I caught him between his job calls and the twins' soccer games. He wasn't cruel, just willfully blind. Sometimes he'd stand in the doorway of my room, say I looked tired, then rush off before I could answer. It was Lacey's laughter that filled the house now, brittle, performative, constant, the kind of laughter that announces its own virtue. One afternoon, she arranged a family meeting. It was in the kitchen, at the long marble island she treated like a throne. She spoke slowly, clearly, explaining that with my recent cognitive decline, she decided to take over my remaining financial accounts. She said it was temporary, just until I felt stronger. Daniel nodded absently, scrolling his phone. She didn't notice how my hands remained perfectly still. Inside, something tightened, a calm clarity that only comes when you realize you've been cornered and have stopped fearing the edge. That night when the house slept, I slipped out of my locked room through the adjoining bathroom's vent window. The chill air bit at my skin, but I moved quietly, like someone walking through a memory. I crossed the yard to the neighbor's side, Mrs. Adler, a retired librarian who still left her porch light on till midnight. She saw me from the window and opened the door before I even knocked. I didn't tell her everything, only that I needed to store a small folder in her safe for a while. She nodded. Women of a certain age understand unspoken things. The following days, I played my part. I acted forgetful, compliant, grateful. I praised Lacey's cooking, nodded at her suggestions, and made sure to ask for help with tasks I could do myself. The more helpless I appeared, the bolder she became. By late spring, she'd fully rewritten the story of our household. To visitors, she was the selfless caretaker managing her frail mother-in-law. I became a prop in her performance, the quiet, confused widow who smiled vaguely at her own rescue. But beneath that mask, I was gathering threads. One of them came from the most unlikely source, the twins' homework folder. They'd been tasked with drawing their family tree, and I noticed something peculiar. In Lacey's version of the family structure, my name wasn't written beside Harold's anymore. Instead, she'd drawn herself next to Daniel under a single label: householders. It was a child's handwriting, but the words struck me like a warning bell. Later that week, a letter arrived from the county clerk's office addressed to the Holloway Trust primary administrator. Lacey left it on the table, assuming I couldn't understand what it meant. But the envelope was thin, and through the light I could see the outline of words like amendment and signatory. I began to suspect that she'd filed something, perhaps using power of attorney forms she'd coaxed Daniel into signing. Harold's clause might still protect me, but only if it came to light at the right time. And so I called the notary. Her name was Gwen. Her voice was calm, older, the kind of tone that instantly builds trust. We met at the library under the pretense of updating my identification. I handed her the binder, and she read through the section Harold had written. She frowned, then smiled faintly. She explained that it was an irrevocable spousal clause, buried in an old trust agreement Harold had set up through his engineering firm years ago. It ensured that the marital residence could never be sold, transferred, or refinanced without my explicit consent while I lived, regardless of future amendments. That meant one thing: any attempt by Lacey to alter ownership or control the property was legally invalid. I felt tears gather, but they weren't from sadness. They were the kind that come when justice is suddenly visible on the horizon, still distant but undeniable. I asked Gwen what I should do. She advised me to make copies, notarize the key pages, and keep them somewhere safe. She also suggested I contact the law office that originally handled the trust. The name was printed on the footer. Henderson and Moore, Columbus, OH. That evening, while Lacey was in the bath, I called from my locked room using the landline she'd forgotten to disconnect. A paralegal named Jenny answered. I explained who I was and mentioned Harold's name. There was a pause, the kind of pause that tells you something important just clicked in someone's memory. Jenny said she'd pull the files and call me back the next morning. I didn't sleep that night. I watched the first light creep across the walls, softening the edges of my prison. The call came at 9:15. Jenny confirmed everything. Harold's trust remained active, the clause was untouched, and my consent was legally required for any property transaction. She also mentioned a small but crucial detail. Harold had added an amendment a year before his death, naming me as contingent executor of the trust in the event Daniel became incapacitated or compromised by undue influence. Those words echoed. Undue influence, it was as if Harold had seen this coming. That afternoon, I started planning, not for confrontation, not yet, but for preservation. I made a second set of copies and hid them inside my quilt beneath the stitched square of our wedding date. I kept another in Mrs. Adler's safe beside my will. Over the next month, I played my role so well that even Lacey seemed to relax. She started hosting small dinners again, inviting her friends from the Homeowners Association, polished women with practiced smiles. I watched them through the cracked door, their laughter like champagne bubbles, brittle and bright. Lacey would tell stories about managing an aging household as if she were describing a hobby. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger wastes precision. I was patient. Justice, after all, ripens slowly, and it would ripen soon, because one morning a letter arrived from the county court. It was addressed to the estate of Harold J. Holloway, notification of probate review. Lacey opened it in front of me, glancing quickly before sliding it into her planner. She said it was routine, but I saw the date, June 14, the estate hearing. I looked at her then, really looked at the self-satisfied posture, the shallow triumph of someone who believes the finish line is already crossed. I smiled inwardly. She had no idea that the real finish line had been drawn by Harold himself, years before she'd ever entered this house. The week before the hearing, the house seemed to hum with nervous energy. Lacey was a storm in motion, printing documents, making calls, shuffling papers that she guarded like treasure. Daniel followed her cues, though his energy was different. Anxious, distracted, compliant. He was a man trying to keep the peace without realizing which side of the battlefield he stood on. Meanwhile, I moved like a ghost through their carefully curated world. Every time she left for errands, I'd wander to the back room, Harold's old study, now stripped of his things. The shelves were empty, except for a few of my photo albums she hadn't bothered to toss. I opened one, and the scent of dust and lavender rose from the pages. There we were, in our first home, me in my sewing apron, Harold holding a coffee cup with that half-smile that never reached his eyes fully unless he was looking at me. It steadied me, reminded me that what I was doing wasn't revenge, it was restoration. 3 days before the hearing, Jenny from Henderson and Moore called again. She said she'd reviewed the trust thoroughly and confirmed something astonishing. Harold had added a sealed supplemental instruction to the trust file, to be opened only upon dispute or challenge to the spousal clause. It was handwritten, signed, and notarized. Jenny said the court would automatically review that instruction once the probate hearing began. My only task was to attend and verify my identity. My heart fluttered. Harold had left something, maybe a letter, maybe a directive. Whatever it was waiting like a buried fuse. That evening, Lacey made a grand show of compassion over dinner. She cooked a roast, poured wine, and even invited Daniel's friend from work and his wife. She told everyone how grateful she was to care for her late father-in-law's wife and how she hoped the estate proceedings would bring closure. Closure. I almost smiled. When she lifted her glass for a toast, she made sure to lock eyes with me. To new beginnings, she said, and to simplifying old complications. They all laughed politely. Daniel looked uneasy but said nothing. I said quietly, new beginnings do have a way of surprising us, don't they? Her eyes narrowed for a moment, then she smiled, too wide, too rehearsed. The night before the hearing, I slept lightly. I woke at dawn, dressed in Harold's favorite color, a soft blue blouse, and pinned the silver locket he'd given me on our 40th anniversary to my collar. It wasn't for sentiment, it was for armor. At 9 o'clock a.m., a town car arrived. Lacey had ordered it, of course, for appearances. She insisted on handling all the logistics, claiming I wasn't up for driving in traffic. I sat in the back beside her, hands folded over my purse. She kept checking her phone, occasionally sighing dramatically as if rehearsing her victimhood. Daniel sat in front, silent. The tension was thick enough to taste. The courthouse was smaller than I remembered, beige walls, wooden benches, the faint smell of coffee and floor polish. The probate clerk directed us to room 204. A few other families waited in the hall, each with their own small griefs and paperwork. Inside, the air felt colder. A single long table faced the bench where the judge would sit. On the table were neat stacks of folders labeled with names and dates. I saw ours, Holloway Harold J. Lacey's attorney, a slick young man named Mr. Beecham, greeted her with confidence. He gave me a professional nod but didn't bother shaking my hand. That told me everything about the kind of man he was. When the hearing began, Judge Farrow, an older woman with sharp eyes and a patient voice, asked everyone to introduce themselves. Lacey spoke first, identifying herself as the acting financial guardian and family representative. Daniel mumbled his name. When it came to me, I said clearly, Margaret Holloway, widow of Harold J. Holloway and primary beneficiary of his estate. Beecham's pen froze mid-note. Lacey's jaw twitched. The judge flipped through the file. We are here to confirm updates to the trust and address a petition filed by Mrs. Lacey Holloway regarding the transfer of spousal property to joint ownership. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor, Beecham said smoothly. Given Mrs. Holloway's advanced age and her son's assumption of financial responsibility, we simply wish to consolidate holdings to streamline. Streamline, I repeated softly, not for the judge but for myself. Judge Farrow turned a page. Before we proceed, I see a notation regarding a sealed supplemental instruction from Mr. Holloway himself. Henderson and Moore have verified its authenticity. The court is required to open it in session if the spousal clause is under challenge. Is that your understanding? Beecham blinked. Yes, Your Honor, though we weren't aware of its contents. The clerk handed over a cream envelope sealed in wax. The judge broke it carefully, pulling out 2 handwritten pages. She read silently for a long time. Then she leaned forward and began to read aloud. To the Honorable Court, if this instruction is being opened, it means my surviving spouse, Margaret, is facing undue pressure regarding her rights to our home and assets. It was my explicit intention that she retain full control, comfort, and independence for the remainder of her life. Furthermore, should any party, including my son's spouse, attempt to alter, revoke, or interfere with these rights, I instruct that her legal standing be voided regarding all Holloway holdings. In that event, my wife is to become sole trustee and executor of the estate. The courtroom went utterly silent. Lacey's breath caught. Her eyes darted to Beecham, who turned an uncomfortable shade of pink. The judge continued, her tone steady but faintly amused. Mr. Holloway concludes by stating, I trust this measure will protect my wife's dignity and remind others that kindness, not convenience, defines family. A faint gasp rippled through the room. Lacey stammered something. There must be a mistake, but the judge raised her hand. The document is witnessed and notarized. Unless you have evidence of forgery, the instruction stands. Beecham whispered furiously to Lacey, but she was pale now, her confidence draining fast. I sat perfectly still. I felt no triumph yet, only a quiet, measured peace. The judge turned to me. Mrs. Holloway, you remain the legal executor and beneficiary. Any attempted property transfers without your signature are null. The court will issue immediate confirmation to that effect. Daniel exhaled, a sound of shock and relief tangled together, but it wasn't over, not yet. Because Harold's letter had one final line, handwritten at the bottom, the judge hesitated, then read it aloud. Lastly, should any dispute arise, my wife holds authority to determine who may reside in our home henceforth. A murmur ran through the spectators. Lacey's eyes widened. You can't mean, the judge nodded calmly. It means Mrs. Holloway may decide your living arrangements, Mrs. Lacey Holloway. That is the law as written by your late father-in-law. For a moment, the world seemed to still. I could hear the hum of the fluorescent light, the shuffle of a paper, the sound of someone's pen dropping to the floor. Then I stood, slowly, carefully, and I said, Your Honor, I would like to exercise that right. Lacey turned toward me, face frozen in disbelief. I met her eyes, steady as stone. I will not have anyone under my roof who calls care control or who locks doors in the name of love. The judge nodded. So ordered. The gavel struck once, sharp, clean, final. Lacey made a small choking sound, part outrage, part fear. Beecham leaned in to whisper something, but she shook her head numbly. Daniel reached out to her, but she brushed him away. As the clerk filed the ruling, the faintest smile touched my lips. It wasn't cruel. It was the kind of smile that comes when something long broken finally clicks into place. Outside the courthouse, the sunlight felt warmer than it had in years. When I stepped outside that courthouse, it felt like stepping out of a fog I hadn't even known I'd been breathing in. The air was sharp with the scent of cold stone and rain from earlier that morning. I watched Lacey standing on the steps, whispering furiously to her lawyer while pretending not to tremble. Her hands were clasped tight around her purse, knuckles pale. Daniel stood a few feet away, face drawn, looking everywhere except at her. I didn't rush, I let the sunlight find my face, the way it used to when Harold and I would leave Sunday service and sit quietly in the car before going home. The world felt solid again, like I could finally feel my feet on the ground. The clerk had given me a certified copy of the court's ruling, stamped in blue, my name written clearly in bold type. Executor and beneficiary, Margaret L. Holloway. For the first time in a long time, I saw my name where it belonged, not as an afterthought or an encumbrance, but as the rightful keeper of what Harold and I had built. Daniel walked toward me then. He didn't say anything for a long moment. His expression was caught between guilt and shame, two shades of the same regret. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, uncertain. He said he hadn't known Lacey was planning to petition the court. That she'd told him it was just paperwork, that she'd said it was for my security. I believed him, at least. I believed that he had chosen not to know. It was easier for him that way. Easier to let her handle the ugly details while he stayed neutral, safe in his own silence. I told him he didn't need to explain. That understanding could come later if he truly wanted it to. He nodded, eyes glistening, and walked back toward Lacey, who was now refusing to meet either of our gazes. The drive home was quiet. Lacey insisted on riding with Daniel, while the driver took me separately. As we passed through town, I saw familiar landmarks, the post office where I used to mail Harold's business letters, the old diner where we'd had breakfast every anniversary until his health declined. Every corner of that town carried an echo of our shared life, and now that life was mine again, not as a possession, but as a piece I'd earned. When we reached the house, I asked the driver to stop at the edge of the driveway. I wanted to walk the rest of the way myself. The afternoon light draped the yard in gold. The wind chimes by the porch swayed softly, their sound like distant laughter. Inside, the air was still. The faint scent of lemon cleaner lingered from Lacey's morning routine. She had always liked things that gleamed, but never things that glowed. The difference between polished and alive was something she never understood. I walked through each room slowly, the living room with its rearranged furniture, the kitchen stripped of its warmth, the guest room where she had locked me. Each space held traces of her control, like fingerprints on glass. When I reached the study, I unlocked the desk drawer she hadn't noticed I'd fixed. Inside was Harold's fountain pen, still half full of ink, the paperweight from our honeymoon in Maine, and a small brass key. The key fit an old lockbox that had been tucked away in the linen closet, something she'd probably assumed was empty. Inside were Harold's ledgers, his final notes, and a letter addressed simply to my Margaret. I sat on the edge of the bed and read it there, the paper trembling slightly in my hands. He'd written it only a few months before his passing. The words were steady, careful, his handwriting familiar enough to make my heart ache. He said he'd known that I would face challenges once he was gone, that Lacey's ambition had an edge sharper than she realized, and that Daniel's softness would make him blind to it. He said he'd added that clause to protect not just our home, but my spirit. He ended with a line that caught in my throat. If they ever try to shut you out, promise me you'll open the door for yourself. I read that line 3 times. Then I folded the letter carefully and set it on the desk. That night, the house was quieter than it had been in years. I could hear the faint murmur of their argument downstairs, her clipped tone, his tired sighs. It wasn't anger that filled me now, only clarity. I had spent months, maybe years, shrinking myself so as not to be a burden, but it had never been kindness to make myself small. The next morning, I called Henderson and Moore. I told Jenny to proceed with executing Harold's final instruction fully, including the residential authority clause. She confirmed it meant I had the right to decide who could or could not reside in the Holloway property. I asked her what the legal process was to formalize that. She said a simple written notice, signed by me and filed with the county clerk, would suffice. By noon, the notice was printed, signed, and sealed. It was brief, just a few lines. Effective immediately, Mrs. Lacey Holloway is no longer permitted residence at the Holloway property. Temporary accommodations will be provided for 30 days to allow transition. I left a copy on the kitchen table with her name neatly underlined. When she returned from her errands that afternoon, she saw it before I even looked up from my tea. I could see the exact moment her breath caught, the disbelief, then the fury, then the dawning realization that this time there was no argument to win. She started pacing, muttering under her breath. I didn't respond. She said something about calling her lawyer, about contesting the ruling, about how unfair it was. I stayed silent. When she demanded to know where I expected her to go, I simply said she had 30 days to figure that out. That night, Daniel knocked on my door. He didn't come in, he just stood there for a moment and said he understood. That maybe it was time for them to have their own place. There was a tired sadness in his voice, but also relief, as if he'd been waiting for someone to make a decision he couldn't. The next few weeks moved quickly. Lacey grew quieter, more withdrawn. Her confidence had cracked. The house that had once felt like her stage now felt too large, too alive for her control. I caught her once standing by the window of the study, staring at Harold's portrait. She looked lost, almost small. When the movers came, she didn't look at me. She gathered her boxes, her neatly folded life, and walked down the hall without a word. The echo of her heels faded until all that remained was the soft rustle of curtains and the creak of the old floorboards. When the door finally shut behind her, the house exhaled. I swear it did. I walked through each room again, touching the walls, feeling the air move differently now, lighter, freer. I opened the locked door to the guest room and left it wide open, not out of defiance, but as a reminder. No more closed doors in this home. That evening, I brewed a fresh pot of coffee and sat on the porch. The wind carried the scent of lilacs just beginning to bloom. Daniel called later, saying he'd found a small apartment across town. He wanted to come by to check on me soon, maybe even help with the garden like he used to when he was little. I told him I'd like that. After the call, I looked out toward the horizon where the sun dipped low, turning everything gold. I thought of Harold, of his steady faith in me, his quiet foresight, of the way he'd written that one sentence that changed everything. It hadn't been revenge, it had been respect, resurrected through law and love and a single stroke of his pen. After Lacey left, silence settled into the house like a respectful guest. It didn't feel empty, it felt right. I could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall again, the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of wood as the house adjusted to breathing freely. These were the sounds of peace. The first morning after, I walked through the kitchen barefoot, feeling the cool tile under my feet. The morning sun came through the curtains, touching the countertop where she'd always kept everything spotless but soulless. I brewed coffee the way Harold liked it, strong, black, with 1 cube of sugar, and poured it into his old mug with the chipped handle. For the first time in a long while, I sat at the table without feeling like an unwelcome guest in my own home. I should have felt triumphant, but what I felt instead was something quieter, balance. The kind of balance that comes when something unjust is finally set right. Later that week, Jenny from the law office called. She said the judge had asked me to come by to sign one last piece of paperwork, something regarding the distribution of Harold's community assets. I agreed. The next day, I put on my navy cardigan and my pearl earrings, the ones Harold gave me for our 40th anniversary, and drove into town. The courthouse smelled faintly of dust and paper. Ginny met me at the clerk's office, her usual calm professionalism softened by something almost affectionate. She told me that Harold's secondary estate file contained an addendum, one that the court had been waiting to process pending confirmation of residence rights. Now that the hearing was resolved, they could finalize it. She handed me a thin envelope marked Private Addendum H.L. Holloway. I signed the release form and opened it right there at the counter. Inside was another letter, this one shorter, typed on Harold's stationery. It said that years ago, Harold had purchased a small commercial property, a modest bakery building downtown, but had never transferred ownership to the business itself. He'd kept it under his personal trust with a conditional clause. Upon my death, the property shall remain under the stewardship of my spouse, Margaret L. Holloway, and may be leased, sold, or gifted at her discretion. My breath caught. I remembered that bakery, Sweet Haven. Lacey had been managing it ever since she convinced Daniel to invest part of their savings into it. It had become her pride, her image in town. People called it her bakery. I had never known Harold still held the deed. Jenny must have noticed the realization crossing my face. She explained gently that Lacey had been leasing the building through Harold's trust, not owning it. And now, by court validation, I was the trustee. In other words, I was the landlord. For a moment, I just stood there, the paper trembling between my fingers. Then a slow, steady warmth filled my chest. It wasn't vindictive. It was poetic. The universe, or maybe Harold himself, had tied the bow on this quiet lesson in respect. That afternoon, I went to the bakery. The bell above the door chimed, the air thick with the smell of sugar and cinnamon. Lacey wasn't there, of course. She'd been avoiding me since the move, but the girl behind the counter recognized me. She smiled and said, "Oh, Mrs. Holloway, Lacey said you'd probably stop by for the cinnamon rolls." I nodded, though she misunderstood my reason for being there. I ordered a coffee, took a seat near the window, and watched the customers filter in. Most of them were locals, familiar faces from church or the grocery store. They chatted, laughed, ordered pastries, completely unaware of the silent shift in ownership that had just occurred. On the counter near the register was a framed photo of Lacey and Daniel standing in front of the bakery sign, smiling as if they'd built it all from scratch. I studied that photo for a long time. Then, when I finished my coffee, I left a small envelope addressed to Mrs. L. Holloway with the cashier. Inside was a polite notice, formal but fair. Effective next quarter, the lease on the property known as 211 Main Street shall be subject to review and renewal by the property's current owner, Mrs. Margaret Holloway. New terms and rent adjustment will apply. When the cashier asked if I wanted her to give it directly to Lacey, I said no. I told her just to leave it in the office mail slot. The drive home was serene. The world outside looked different, not because it had changed, but because I finally had the eyes to see it clearly. Every injustice I'd endured, every quiet moment of humiliation had not destroyed me. They had revealed me. That evening, Daniel called. His tone was softer now, more grounded. He said Lacey had been distant, withdrawn. He wanted to apologize again for everything. I told him there was nothing to forgive, only things to learn. He asked if I'd come by their new apartment for dinner next week. I said I'd think about it. The next morning, Jenny called again, this time to confirm that Lacey had already contacted the office about the lease notice. Apparently, she'd been quite emotional. Jenny's voice was neutral, but I could almost hear the amused restraint behind it. She said Lacey had demanded to know how it was possible. Jenny had simply told her, "Mrs. Holloway is now the legal trustee. All correspondence goes through her." I spent the rest of that day tending to my garden. The roses had bloomed beautifully that season, deep crimson and soft pink, their petals brushing against my fingertips as I trimmed them. I thought about how growth works, how it requires both sunlight and pruning, how too much of either can destroy a plant. A few days later, a thick envelope arrived at my door. It was from Lacey's attorney, a man named Briggs. Inside was a formal request for renegotiation of lease terms, along with an offer to buy the property outright. The offer was generous, almost desperate. I read every word, then folded the papers neatly and placed them on the table. That night, I sat by the fireplace with Harold's letter beside me. I thought about the meaning of ownership, not just of property, but of dignity. For years, I had allowed others to define my place, to determine my worth based on convenience. But worth isn't granted, it's remembered. The next morning, I wrote my response. It was short, polite, and final. "Dear Mr. Briggs, thank you for your client's offer regarding 211 Main Street. After careful consideration, I have decided not to sell at this time. The current lease may continue under new terms to be discussed in person. Respectfully, Margaret L. Holloway." 2 days later, I drove into town again. When I entered the bakery this time, the air felt charged like the moment before a summer storm. Lacey was there behind the counter, dressed impeccably as always, but her eyes darted nervously when she saw me. I didn't need to say anything. I simply handed her the official lease document, stamped, signed, and effective immediately. Her hands trembled as she took it. She glanced at the signature, then back at me, confusion turning into disbelief. I could almost hear her thoughts, the disbelief that I, the woman she once called a burden, now owned the very ground beneath her feet. There was no triumph in that moment, only quiet justice. I turned to leave, pausing at the door just long enough to glance back. She was still staring at the document, her confidence slipping away one heartbeat at a time. Outside, the air smelled of freshly baked bread and rain. The town felt alive, steady, and fair again. When I reached home, I took out Harold's letter one last time and whispered a quiet thank you. He had known all along how to protect me, not through force, but through foresight. Justice, I realized, isn't always loud. Sometimes it's written in fine print, sealed and waiting, patient as a promise kept. The next few weeks unfolded with the slow, deliberate rhythm of something finally setting itself right. The world didn't explode with drama, it simply shifted, one quiet inch at a time, and every inch felt like truth reclaiming space it had been denied. Lacey kept the bakery open, though word spread fast about the ownership clarification. In a small town like ours, whispers moved faster than the mail. People didn't gloat, not outright, but they remembered. Many of them had seen how she'd spoken to me over the years, at church luncheons or block parties, that subtle tone of superiority she wrapped in sweetness. They remembered the look in my eyes when she'd called me old-fashioned or in the way. Now, when I walked into the bakery, there was a shift, not in her voice, but in her posture. She'd stiffen, smile a little too wide, and say things like, "Good morning, Margaret, can I get you your usual?" It wasn't revenge I felt, it was equilibrium. I'd take my coffee, sometimes a cinnamon roll, and sit near the window like before. The same spot where she once bragged to customers about her business, her hard work. I watched her now, the way she moved, the way she smiled. There was still pride in her, but it had lost its edge. One afternoon, she approached my table herself. Her hands were clasped tight, knuckles white. "Mrs. Holloway," she began, in a tone that tried to sound professional. I got your new lease terms. They're fair, more than fair." I nodded. "I thought so," she hesitated, glancing around before lowering her voice. I wanted to say I didn't mean for things to get ugly. I just, well, you know how it is. Things were tight. I panicked. "Of course," I said, stirring my coffee. "People show their truest selves when things get tight." Her face flickered like she wanted to argue but couldn't. "You know, I didn't know about the ring, not what was inside it. I swear I know," I interrupted gently. "You didn't care to know, there's a difference." She bit her lip, then nodded. "Daniel's been working extra shifts to pay off some of the debts. I'm trying to fix things." "That's good," I said. "Fixing things takes time." "It starts with honesty." Her eyes dropped to the floor, and for the first time I saw something real in them, not guilt, weariness. The kind of exhaustion that comes from realizing you've built your comfort on someone else's quiet suffering. Before leaving, she asked softly, "Do you ever think you'll forgive me?" I looked out the window at the reflection of sunlight on the glass. "Forgiveness isn't a key," I said. "It's a door you walk through when you're ready to leave the room you built for your own regret." "I'm already outside." She didn't respond, just stood there for a long moment, then nodded and walked back behind the counter. I left the bakery that day lighter than I'd felt in years. That evening, Daniel came by. He brought a box of groceries, something he hadn't done in months, and insisted on helping me fix the squeaky screen door. His face was tired, but his eyes were clear. "Mom," he said finally after tightening the last screw, "I don't know how to thank you for not pushing us out harder than you could have." "I wasn't trying to push anyone," I said. "Just to stand where I belong." He nodded, looking down. "Lacey's been humbled. She's learning, I think." "Good," I said softly. "Learning's the only road that leads anywhere worth going." We ate dinner together, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans. I made enough for leftovers, like always. It was simple, but it felt sacred somehow. After dinner, Daniel lingered at the table. "Dad really thought things through, didn't he?" he said. "That ring, the bakery, everything." I smiled faintly. "He trusted that time would show truth better than anger ever could." Daniel nodded. "He always did play the long game." When he left, I stood at the door watching his car disappear down the street. I thought of Harold's laugh, his steady hands, his unshakable belief that people reveal themselves in due time. He'd been right. By early spring, the bakery began to change. Lacey added new items to the menu, but the energy inside was different now, humbler, more careful. I noticed she'd taken down the photo of her and Daniel and replaced it with a framed quote that read, "Grace is not weakness. It is wisdom refusing to shout." I wondered if she'd meant it as an apology. The townsfolk started talking again, but this time with something like respect. One woman at the grocery store stopped me in the produce aisle and said, "Margaret, I heard about everything that happened. You handled it beautifully. I wish I had your patience." I smiled politely. Patience is what you have when anger's too heavy to carry anymore. At church, Pastor Lewis used me as an example in one of his sermons, something about faith, dignity, and the quiet justice of time. I sat in the pews and felt Harold's presence beside me, warm and proud. One Sunday afternoon, while pruning the garden, I found the velvet box that had once held my wedding ring. I opened it, running my thumb along the indent where the ring had rested. I'd long since taken the small note from inside to keep in my locket, but the box still smelled faintly of roses and cedar, the scent of Harold's cologne. I took it to my work table and began writing a new note on the same kind of thick paper he used to prefer. "To whoever finds this in years to come, Know that love is not measured by what we hold, but by what we honor. If ever you are wronged, remember silence can be stronger than shouting. The truth will always outlive the lie. I folded the note and tucked it inside the box again. Then I placed it in my cedar chest, right next to the envelope Harold had left me. It felt right, a continuation of the circle. One day, out of habit more than hunger, I stopped by the bakery again. It was nearly empty except for an elderly couple sipping coffee near the door. Lacey was wiping down tables, her hair pulled back, her movements slower, more deliberate. When she saw me, she smiled, a real one this time. "Mrs. Holloway," she said softly, "we baked something special today. Blueberry scones, your husband's favorite." My breath caught a little. "You remembered that? I found one of his old recipes in the storage box behind the counter," she said. He'd written it on a napkin. I thought maybe it was a sign. She brought one over, still warm, and set it gently on my plate. "On the house." I took a bite. It was perfect, not too sweet, not too dense, just right. We didn't say much after that. But in that silence, something shifted again, not back to what was before, but forward to something new. I finished the scone, thanked her, and stood. "You're learning," I said softly. She nodded. "I am." Outside, the day was bright and breezy. The bakery bell chimed behind me as I stepped into the sunlight. I thought about the journey from humiliation to peace, from silence to quiet justice. Life, I realized, had its own way of balancing the scales. You didn't always need to tip them yourself. Sometimes you just had to stop holding them still. That night, I lit a candle by Harold's photo. "You were right, love," I whispered. Time told the truth. I sat back in my chair, the flame flickering in the dim light, and smiled. There was no need for revenge when life itself had already written the perfect ending. Time, I've learned, has a rhythm you can't rush. After everything that happened, I stopped trying to measure my life by what was taken and started counting what had quietly stayed. The house, my garden, the laughter of neighbors who stopped by with casseroles and stories. Even the morning light, it seemed to rest softer on the curtains now, like it too had been waiting for the storm to pass. Daniel began visiting every Sunday. Sometimes he'd bring groceries, sometimes just himself. He mowed the lawn without me asking, fixed the porch light, and stayed for dinner. We didn't talk much about what had happened, the estate hearing, the bakery, the years of silence before it. It was as if the air itself refused to go backward. But there was a calmness between us, a gentle understanding that love doesn't always apologize out loud. Sometimes it just shows up and starts helping again. Lacey kept her distance at first. I'd see her in town, at the post office or the farmer's market, always polite but never lingering. She looked thinner, quieter, like the weight of her own choices had finally settled in. And yet, there was something new in her too, a kind of humility that made her less sharp around the edges. One morning, a letter arrived in the mail addressed to me in careful handwriting. The envelope was plain, but inside was a note written on the bakery's stationery. "Mrs. Holloway, I've been thinking about what your husband wrote, the part about the truth finding its way. I used to think truth was something you could bury under charm and hard work, but I see now that when you build on lies, the ground always shifts. I've been trying to make things right. The bakery's name will stay the same, but I've added a small plaque near the register. I hope you'll see it someday." Lacey, I sat with that letter for a long while. My first instinct was to dismiss it. After all, written apologies can be easier than spoken ones. But something about the tone felt different. I folded it carefully and set it beside Harold's framed photo. He'd always believed people could change if life taught them properly. Maybe, finally, it had. The next day I went to see for myself. The bakery smelled the same, butter, sugar, and the faint aroma of brewed coffee. The bell over the door still chimed that soft, tinny note that used to make my heart twist. But the space felt different now. The chatter was subdued, the counters spotless, the display cases simple. Then I saw the plaque. It was mounted on the wall near the register, just above the framed quote about grace. It read, "The Holloway Bakery, founded in love, restored in truth." Below that, in smaller letters, in memory of Harold and Margaret Holloway, whose kindness built more than walls. I didn't move for a moment. My throat tightened, not from pride exactly, but from something deeper, the quiet acknowledgement that I had lived long enough to see integrity return to a place it had once abandoned. Lacey came out from the kitchen and froze when she saw me. Her apron was dusted with flour, her face flushed from work. She didn't rush to speak. She just nodded once, slow and deliberate. I nodded back. That was enough. Weeks passed, and with them came spring's renewal. My lilacs bloomed early that year, bright and fragrant, almost as if Harold had sent them. I found myself smiling more, humming again while doing chores. The heaviness that had lived in my chest for months was fading into something lighter, something like peace. Still, the world has a way of testing your calm just when you've found it. One afternoon, a county officer came by with some documents for me to sign, finalizations related to the estate settlement. It was routine, he said, just confirming property boundaries and trust details. I sat at my kitchen table, flipping through the pages, until my eyes caught something strange. The bakery's land parcel had been reassigned, not to me, not to Lacey, but to a new holding company bearing both our names. The officer explained that Lacey had formally petitioned to return partial ownership to me, acknowledging my role as co-founder and moral stakeholder. It wasn't just symbolic, it was legal. I was once again part owner of the business I'd built from scratch decades ago. My hand trembled slightly as I signed. The officer smiled kindly and said, "Not something we see every day, folks making things right like this." After he left, I sat in the quiet for a long time. There was a faint breeze coming through the open window, carrying the scent of lilacs. I thought of Harold again, his patience, his foresight, his belief that good soil can still grow flowers even after a fire. For the first time in years, I felt fully at peace. Summer rolled in with its lazy warmth. The bakery thrived again, now a hub for the community. People came not just for the pastries, but for what the place represented: redemption, resilience, second chances. Lacey introduced a new line of baked goods called Legacy Loaves, and beneath the menu board she'd written in chalk, "Some recipes take time, some take truth." I started volunteering again, this time teaching young girls how to bake at the community center. Watching their hands knead dough reminded me of myself in my 20s, full of dreams, yet unaware of how easily trust can be bruised. Sometimes I'd tell them, "Every recipe is a lesson. If you rush it, it collapses. If you tend it, it rises." They'd giggle, but I'd see in their eyes that they understood more than they let on. One evening, after class, I walked home through the park. The sky was melting into shades of peach and lavender. I thought about the strange journey of my life, how humiliation had turned to quiet strength, how betrayal had carved out space for grace. There's a peace that comes not from winning, but from simply knowing the truth stood up by itself. A few months later, the town paper published a small feature about the bakery. It praised its revival, its community spirit, and the story behind its new name. They quoted Lacey saying, "I once believed success was about owning everything. Now I know it's about honoring what was given to you." Reading that, I felt a tear slide down my cheek. I wasn't crying for sadness, it was relief. Relief that the world had not gone entirely blind to justice. Daniel brought me a copy of the paper that evening, folded neatly in half. He'd highlighted the section about his father's legacy. "Dad would have liked this," he said softly. "Yes," I whispered. "He always believed the truth would bloom, even in bad soil." Daniel smiled faintly, eyes glistening. "You did too, Mom. You just didn't know it yet." We sat together in silence after that, the kind of silence that holds gratitude rather than pain. That night, I opened my old journal and began to write again. For months, I hadn't touched it. I'd been too focused on surviving, on staying dignified. But now, the words came easily. I have learned that power doesn't come from shouting louder or fighting harder. It comes from knowing when to stand still and let the truth do its work. I was wronged, yes, but I was also reminded that strength wears quiet shoes. I closed the journal and placed it beside the candle by Harold's photo. Outside, crickets sang their steady song and the air smelled of late summer and distant rain. For the first time in a long while, I felt that everything in my life, every mistake, every betrayal, every breath had led here. To peace earned, not granted. Autumn arrived like a deep exhale. The air cooled, the light softened, and the bakery's front windows fogged up each morning from the warmth inside. I found myself walking there almost daily now, not as a watchful guardian, but as a quiet participant in the life I'd helped build long ago. The plaque caught the sunlight each time I passed. I never stopped to touch it, though sometimes I did linger long enough to feel its presence. The past had already been acknowledged. I didn't need to keep reopening the wound. Still, knowing that the truth had been carved into brass, not hidden, not rewritten, made every morning feel like a small victory. Lacey and I had learned a new rhythm. We didn't pretend to be close, but there was a steady civility between us that grew into something resembling respect. Once, she sent over a small box of pastries with a note that simply said, "Thank you for not destroying me when you could have." It made me smile, not for her words, but for the quiet truth behind them. Justice, I realized, didn't need applause, it just needed to be seen. Life moved forward in its patient way. Daniel remarried to a kind woman named Claire who taught at the local elementary school. She treated me with the sort of warmth that feels effortless, never performative, never forced. When they came over for dinner, she helped me wash dishes and hummed under her breath. I noticed how Daniel's shoulders relaxed around her, and it gave me comfort to see my son at peace again. One evening, as we cleared the table, Claire mentioned that Lacey had applied to sponsor a local apprenticeship for single mothers learning business skills. The bakery was funding it through a community grant. She said it with a tone that suggested she understood the full circle of it, that the woman who once took from others was now trying to give something back. That night, lying in bed, I thought about Harold again, his handwriting, his will. That single sentence that changed everything. Should my wife ever be treated as less than a partner in the legacy we built, the law shall remember what love cannot forget. Those words had carried me through the storm. They were his voice beyond time, steady and protective. I still heard it sometimes when I walked past the bakery at dusk, as though the air itself repeated it in the hum of the neon sign. A few weeks later, I received an invitation in the mail embossed in gold. It was for the Holloway Bakery Foundation Gala, the first charity event Lacey had organized under the new partnership. I hesitated before deciding to go. Part of me feared the whispers, the small-town curiosity about the woman whose daughter-in-law tried to erase her. But another part of me knew it wasn't about pride anymore. It was about witnessing something that had healed instead of festered. The night of the gala, I wore my navy dress, the one Harold had always said made me look like dignity itself. When I entered, the music softened, as if even the piano understood the weight of that moment. Lacey approached me slowly, her posture composed but eyes uncertain. She told me that the foundation would be funding scholarships for women starting late-life careers, and one of them would bear my name. The Margaret Holloway Renewal Grant. She said she hoped it might honor the strength it takes to start over when the world thinks you're done. I didn't answer right away. I just looked around the room, at the laughter, the light, the clinking of glasses. And then at her, this woman who had once locked me in my own room for my own good. People can change, not quickly, not cleanly, but deeply, when the mirror they're forced to face is honest enough, so I nodded, slowly. Then I reached out and touched her arm just once. That was all. After that night, I stopped visiting the bakery every day. It didn't feel necessary anymore. It was as if my presence had been a bridge, something meant to be crossed, not clung to. I spent more time in my garden instead. The lilacs had given way to chrysanthemums, sturdy and bright, refusing to fade even when the frost began creeping in. I took their resilience as a kind of personal message from nature. Endurance can be gentle. Sometimes, when neighbors passed by, they'd ask about the bakery or the hearing. I'd smile and tell them the short version, that everything had worked out as it should. They always looked a little surprised, as if they'd expected bitterness instead of peace. But bitterness takes energy I no longer owe anyone. One quiet morning, I sat by the window with my coffee and looked out over the lawn. The sun was barely rising, painting everything gold. I opened my journal and wrote my final entry on the subject, a kind of personal closing statement. People often think justice arrives with noise, with punishment or spectacle, but I've learned that the truest justice is quiet. It's the kind that leaves you breathing easier, sleeping deeper, smiling again without realizing it. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means understanding that you survived, and that survival itself is proof of worth. If you ever find yourself locked behind a door someone swears is for your own good, remember, no one can define your freedom for you. Unlocking yourself starts long before you turn the key. I closed the journal and watched the light shift across the floorboards. For a moment, I thought I heard Harold's chuckle, that low, approving sound he used to make when something finally fell into place. Maybe it was just the house settling, maybe not. Either way, I smiled. Months passed, then a year. The bakery thrived, the foundation grew, and life unfolded with its usual blend of sweetness and ache. I attended Daniel's anniversary party, met new grandchildren, and even started painting again. Every now and then, when I walked downtown, I'd see someone pause by the plaque at the bakery, tracing the engraved words with their fingers. I never told them who I was. Some things are better left as quiet legacies. But sometimes, when I passed the window and saw Lacey behind the counter, older now, softer, with streaks of gray threading through her hair, she would glance up and meet my eyes. She'd nod, I'd nod back. That was our unspoken truth. The past acknowledged, the debt settled, the dignity restored. It's funny, the things you remember, not the outbursts or the courtroom tension, but the tiny mercies. The nurse who smuggled me an extra blanket in those early days, the neighbor who brought soup, the lawyer's calm tone when he read that single sentence that ended the charade. That's what remains when anger burns away, the simple goodness that outlasts cruelty. So if you're listening to this somewhere, maybe in your own kitchen with the hum of the refrigerator behind you, hear me when I say this: you are not a burden. You are the proof that quiet strength can move mountains. You are the one who survives, and in surviving, you become the justice you once prayed for. The last time I walked past the bakery, a young woman held the door open for me. She smiled and said she'd heard of me, that she'd applied for the renewal grant. Her eyes sparkled with that blend of fear and hope that comes with beginning again. I wished her luck and told her the same thing I tell everyone now. Don't rush your healing. The truth always finds its way, and when it does, make sure you're ready to stand tall beside it. Then I kept walking, the sound of the bell fading behind me, the cool air wrapping around like a benediction. The camera, if there were one, would pull back slowly from the old woman on the sidewalk to the bakery glowing softly in the morning light, to the plaque catching a beam of sun as if it were winking. And over it, just Harold's voice again, quiet and sure: the law shall remember what love cannot forget.